Welcome back, everyone. My name is Nick. This channel is Swiftful Thinking, where we cover all things Swift and SwiftUI related. And this playlist is the SwiftUI Advanced Learning playlist. It's advanced learning because we already did beginner, we did intermediate, and now we're doing advanced topics. And the topic today, of course, is UI testing. Now, if you're following the playlist, you already know in the last video we covered unit testing. And I highly recommend to anyone just joining, watch the unit testing video before the UI testing video. Not only because unit testing is probably more important and more common, but because a lot of what we learned in that video we're going to reuse again in this video. And as you're also going to realize, the last video was significantly longer than this one. And that's because unit testing actually tests the majority of the code in our app. That's testing all of the underlying logic, whereas UI testing is simply testing the UI components of our app. So in SwiftUI apps, it's pretty much just testing the views. Now, the simplest way to think about UI testing is to think about the actual flow that a user is going to actually have in your app. They're literally going to open your app, they're going to click this button, they're going to click that button, maybe they're going to see an alert, maybe they're going to type in a text field. And in UI testing, we are testing to make sure that all of those buttons, all of those clicks are actually working. Because when we create our app, obviously it's going to be working when we first make it, but you never know if maybe you change something or someone else changes something and maybe, for example, a button stops working. Well, if we write really good UI tests, they would then catch to make sure that all of the buttons and things a user can click are actually working as expected. And again, this is just an intro to UI testing. There's much more to UI testing that I am not covering, but I think this will be enough to get you going in creating some UI tests for your app. All right, welcome back, everyone. I am back in our Xcode project, and at the beginning of the last video, I briefly talked about the two types of tests that we have in iOS development. We have unit tests and we have UI tests. And in the last video, I covered in a lot of detail how we write unit tests. And unit tests, I would say, are much more common and much more probably important than UI tests, because unit tests are really testing the logic in your app. All of your view models, your data services, your utilities, all of the actual underlying logic that you are programming most of the time is tested in unit tests. On the other hand, we have UI tests, which are literally just testing the UI of your app. This is literally testing the flow that users are doing in your app. So they open your app, they click this button, they click that button, they type in this text field. That's what we test in UI tests. And in this video, we are strictly going to focus on UI tests. And I do want to point out that if you did not watch the last video on the unit tests, I would highly recommend watching that one first, because a lot of the stuff that we learned in that video carries over to this video, and I'm not going to go into detail again to explain all of that stuff that I already covered. So definitely watch the unit test video first if you can. But if you are ready for this video, we're going to jump into UI tests, and we're going to keep this video pretty simple, because in order to really create UI tests, we need to create UI, and in this bootcamp playlist, we don't have a very complex UI. So what we're going to do in this video is create a very simple UI and then some simple tests, and hopefully that will be enough to get you guys going to actually create UI tests on your own. So without further ado, let's get coding. So I'm going to, in the navigator here, let's right click and create a new file. This will be a SwiftUI view, and let's call this UI testing bootcamp view. Go ahead and click create. I'm just going to move it down below the unit test folder here, and let's click resume. All right, and before we can write any tests, obviously we need to create a little bit of a UI so that we can actually test it. So let's start creating this view. Let's try to keep it as simple as possible. I'm going to create a Z-stack. And in the background of the Z-stack, let's just put maybe a linear gradient, because gradients look so good in SwiftUI. Let's put these on separate lines. Let's go from maybe color.blue to color.black. Why not? Let's start at the top leading and let's end at the bottom trailing. And let's of course make this ignore that safe area. This way we can get that full screen, which looks so good. And on top of this gradient, let's create maybe some content. Let's do a VStack. Let's add a text field so the user can actually type something. And this text field, let's get the data from this from a view model like we would actually do in our app. So let's create a class, UI testing bootcamp view model of type observable object, open the brackets. Let's initialize it in our view at state object private var VM equals the UI testing bootcamp view model. In here, we're going to have a let's call it placeholder text of type string. Let's set it equal to maybe add your name, ... Let's also do a @published var. Let's call this text field text of type string. Set it equal to a blank string for now. And let's use these two variables in our text field. So here, the title will be our viewModel.placeholder text, and the text will be our viewModel.textFieldText. This should be binding with the money sign. Let's click try again to see if it works. And we can barely see it here. So let's give it maybe some modifiers. Let's give it a font of headline. Let's give it maybe some padding. And let's then give it a background color. Maybe just keep it color.white for now. We can add some corner radius here. Let's do 10. And then on the whole VStack, let's add some padding just to push it off the edges there. All right, so we have a text field that says add your name. And below that, we're going to add a button with an action and a label. And the button is going to say sign up. Why not? Let's configure how this looks. So let's make the font also headline. Maybe we'll add some padding here as well. Let's make the frame with a max width of infinity just to match the text field. Let's give it a background of color.white and let's give it a corner radius of 10. It's actually looking very similar to our text field. So let's actually make it maybe color.blue. And we'll give it a foreground color of white. All right, so we have our text field to add your name, and then we click the sign up button. I'm going to take this VStack, I'm going to cut it and make it its own variable. So let's create an extension of UI testing bootcamp view. Let's make a private var. Let's call this maybe sign up layer of type some view. Paste in the sign up layer. All right. I'm going to put this on the screen here. Let's click resume. And we're not going to go through a whole authentication thing here, but when users click sign up, we're going to check if there is text in the text field. And if there is, we're going to just pretend like they're signed in. So in our view model, let's create a func called sign up button pressed. And then in the view here in the button, let's call vm.signupButtonPressed. Inside that function, we're going to very simply say guard text field text.isEmpty else return. So we're going to make sure that it is not empty with the exclamation point here. So as long as it's not empty, let's then pretend like they are signed up. All right, and then let's create a simple @published var. Let's say current user is signed in of type bool, set it equal to false by default. And if we do get their name, let's just then set current user signed in equal to true. And we'll just pretend like they're signed in. So if they type something in here and they click the sign up button, we'll set them equal to signed in. So in our view here, we're going to say if vm.current user is signed in. So if they're signed in, we're going to put some other content, but we'll also do if vm.current user signed in. And if they are not signed in, we'll add the sign up layer. Let's give this a transition of with maybe .move, .leading, why not? And let's test it out. I think the last thing we need to do is just this button. Let's do it with animation, maybe spring. and then we'll call vm.signup button pressed. All right, let's click resume here. If I type in here, it should disappear, but it looks like it didn't really animate. I think that's because these are separate layers here. So let's actually maybe just cut this, make a Z stack, put this inside the Z stack. Let's also give this a frame with a max width of infinity, a max height of infinity. And let's add some fake content here just for a second. So I'm going to add maybe just a text. So I'm going to add maybe just a text that says hello world. And let's give it these same modifiers, except it is going to be trailing. And hopefully this looks a little bit better now. I'm going to type a name, click sign up, animate to the left, and then this will animate in. Let's run it to the simulator one more time. I think it'll look a little bit better on the simulator now. Let's type in a name. This should animate left, and then hello world comes in from the right. Awesome. So now all we're going to do is add one more screen for when we are actually signed in so that we can also test that screen. So what we're going to do is create a separate struct just for that screen. So coming down here, so let's create a struct down here, and let's call this maybe signed in home view of type view. Every view needs a body, and here we are. In here, let's just put text hello world again, just so we can get this working. And then I'm going to come up here and get rid of hello world and use a signed in home view. All right, let's make sure that it is working. Cool. I'm going to move a little faster here when we create this view because I've done these simple views hundreds of times in my courses. So in here, let's add a navigation view so we can do some segues. Inside that, let's add a VStack with spacing of maybe 20. Open the brackets. Inside that VStack, let's add a button. Let's open the parentheses. Let's use the action and label. This first button is going to say maybe show welcome alert. And when we tap this button, we want to present an alert in this view. So I'm going to create an @state private var show alert of type bool. Let's set it equal to false. When we click this button, let's show alert.toggle, and then let's present an alert. So let's add an alert here. Is presented will be binding to the show alert, and then here we just need to return an alert. And I'm just going to keep it simple here. Let's just add some text that says welcome to the app. Why not? All right, and below this, I'm going to add a navigation link because we are in a navigation view, so we can segue with the navigation link. Let's use the destination and label. The destination, let's not even build it out. Let's just have it say destination. And the label, we can just leave it saying navigate for now. Why not? I want to add just a little bit of UI for these buttons. So I'm going to come up here and take the UI that I got for this sign up button. I'm just going to copy it. And let's add it to the alert button here. Let's maybe make the background red. Let's also add it to the navigate label down here. Let's keep this one blue. Why not? Let's check if this is all working now. So let's click resume on the canvas. All right, if I type in my name, I can sign up. Then I'm inside the next view, which let's add a little bit here. Let's create, on the VStack, let's add some padding. And let's also add a navigation title. It says maybe welcome. Let's try it one more time. All right, we got the title here, and then we have our two buttons. Show welcome alert. If I click it, it'll display the alert. And then navigate, if I click it, it'll go to the next destination screen, and then we can come on back. All right. All right, so that is pretty much it for the UI that we're going to build in this video. And believe it or not, there's actually a lot of things that we can test now. So what are the things that we can actually test? Well, the first thing is when the user opens this screen, if they click the sign up button without typing in a name, we want to test that it does not segue to the next screen. We also want to test if a user types in their name and they click the sign up button, that it does go to the next screen. When we're on the next screen, there's a couple things we then want to check. We want to check that if we click the Show Welcome alert, it displays this alert. And if we click the OK button, it dismisses the alert. We then want to check if we click this Navigate button, it goes to this destination screen. And if we click this Back button, it comes back to this Welcome screen. So these tests sound kind of simple, and like right now we know this is all working. I know every time I click this welcome alert, it's going to display this alert because that's what we programmed. But again, writing tests is not necessarily just to make sure that it's working right now, but it's making sure that it always works in the future. So for example, for this welcome alert, we know right now that it works, but you never know if another developer comes in or even yourself and maybe for some reason they moved this modifier somewhere else and it's not on here anymore, but you didn't catch it when you were developing your app. And then you go to release your app in production and you might have a situation where users are in your app and they're clicking the button and it's not working. If you've used apps before, you've probably ran into a situation like this where you're clicking something and it seems like it's not happening. Well, if you had a UI test in place, that test would then start failing and you would know that this button stopped working. So that's basically the whole gist of writing UI tests. It's literally the flow that a user is going to click through when they open your app and start clicking buttons, swiping things, tapping things. That's what UI tests test. A lot of me talking, and that was a lot of setup, and we haven't written a single test yet. So let's start writing some actual tests. And if you were with me in the last video, again, in the unit testing bootcamp, I discussed how when we write tests, we want to put the tests in their own target. So if you see down here, I have a testing target down here for my unit tests. This target is separate from the actual code in my app, which is up in our regular app target here. And just like for the unit tests where I made a separate target, I'm going to create a separate target for the UI tests. This way, the code for my tests is not bundled into the regular target that I'm going to ship to my users. So let's click File, New, and create a new target. In here, let's type test. And again, there are two types of tests. Unit tests I covered in the last video, and now we're going to do UI tests. Click Next. And the name for this target, I'm going to use my regular app name, which right now is Swiftful Thinking Advanced Learning. I'm going to add an underscore and then the word UI tests. For unit tests, we did underscore and then tests. We could have done underscore unit tests. I'm just going to keep it as tests, and then these are going to be UI tests. Again, you don't need to put an underscore here. I just like to. I think it's pretty clean. The big things here, let's make sure we are in Swift, we're in our project, and the target to be tested should be our main app. It should not be our other testing target. So let's click Finish, and we get this new testing target down here that you can see just popped up, and we have a template tests.swift file that Apple actually gives us. So I'm going to click on that quickly, and we can see here some template code that Apple is giving us. And I'm not going to go too much into detail with all of this, but very simply in this file, we have two tests right now. We have a regular test, and then we have a performance test, which measures the time that something takes to complete. For this example, they give us, it is measuring how long it takes to launch the app. Performance tests are much less common than regular tests, and we're just going to focus on regular tests in this intro to UI tests video. We also have a setup function and a teardown function. And basically inside this testing file, we're going to put a whole bunch of tests. So we have 1, we have 2. And if we want to run all of our tests in order, before each test runs, we can do some setup. And then after each test runs, we can do some teardown. So if we need to put code here, we can. Apple is giving us a suggestion that we should set continue after failure to false. So this means if one of our tests fails, let's stop and not continue the rest of the tests. That is actually pretty good, and let's keep that there. There's also a couple comments here that are pretty helpful if you've never done this before. In our first test here, we have, it says UI tests must launch the application that they test. So this is exactly what it means. When you run a UI test, it literally is going to launch the app on the simulator. So unlike in unit tests, where we are testing just a specific view model, a specific class, in UI tests, we're actually just launching the app, just like a user would, and then we're going to click through the app just like a user would. So in this first test example here, we have a little bit of code, so it's giving a reference to the app, and then we are launching the app. And then, of course, there would be other stuff in this test. We then have a nice comment here that we can use recording to start writing UI tests. And that is super handy. Basically, there is a feature in Xcode, and it's this little red button down here. I'm not going to click it just yet. But basically, when we click record, it will then launch a simulator. And instead of having to type in everything we want the test to do, we can actually just click through it on the simulator, and Xcode will record everything that we are clicking through. So it's super handy. We're going to use that in a minute. The last comment here says we can use XCT assert and related functions to verify our tests. And there are so many different XCT asserts. I covered the majority of them in the last video. So if you don't know what XCT assert is, again, I highly recommend watching the unit test video before this and then coming on back. A lot of talking again, but let's actually write some tests now. So just like we did in the last video, I want the files in my UI testing target to basically mimic the files that they're testing inside my main target. So the file that we're going to test is our UI testing bootcamp view that we just made. So inside my UI tests, I'm going to right click and create a new file. We're going to create a new file just for the tests for that view. And in this filter, let's search for testing files. And again, we have unit tests or UI tests. And let's click UI tests, let's click next, and let's call this. We're going to use the same name as the regular file in my app. So it's called UI testing bootcamp view. And then let's give it an underscore and add UI tests. So these will be the UI tests for that view. Let's leave it as XC test case and Swift. Click next. Click create. And once we're inside this file now, we can again see some of that template code that Apple has given us. The only difference in this file is that inside the first test example, instead of adding the code to launch the app inside this test, Apple is now giving it to us another example here where they are launching it inside the setup with error, because the setup with error is going to occur before each of these tests. So this is another way to write it, and I actually like it a little bit better. So I'm going to leave the launch inside this setup with error. We don't need some of this code, so let's just clean this up and delete this, delete some of this, let's delete this. We're not going to do any teardowns here because we're keeping this simple. And then we have our first test example, which we are not going to use, so let's delete it. Let's start writing our first test. And it's just like I discussed in the last video, when you write your tests, you want to be very methodical and logical so that the tests are very clear on what they're supposed to be testing. I am going to jump back to the unit testing bootcamp view model that we did in the last video. I'm going to copy the naming and testing structure that we discussed in the last video. I'm not going to dive so much into detail about this again, but basically when we write tests, we want to use a naming structure that all of our tests are going to be organized with. So the naming structure we're going to use here, it starts with the word test underscore followed by the unit of work, followed by the state under test, followed by the expected behavior. And in the last video, that ended up being basically test followed by the struct or class that we are testing. In this video, we are testing views, which are almost explicitly structs in SwiftUI, so we can just put that as the struct. We then are testing a variable or function inside the struct or class. The difference in UI tests, instead of testing a variable, we're going to test a UI component. So if a user clicks a button, if a user types in a text field, and then of course we're going to have the expected result also. So that's how we're going to name the test, and then inside the test, the logic is going to be structured with a given, a when, and a then. I went into detail with this in the last video. I'm not going to cover it in detail again, but I do want to quickly give a shout out to where I learned this, because I did not make this up myself. I actually learned this in a Hacking with Swift textbook called Testing Swift. So I cannot recommend this book enough. If you finish this video and you really want to dive deeper into any kind of tests in Swift, I definitely recommend checking out this Testing Swift textbook from Paul Hudson, Hacking with Swift. It's only $40 and it covers unit tests, UI tests, test-driven development, and much more. So it is a great textbook and a great resource. But with that said, let's jump back into our code here. Let's write our first test. So I'm going to create a func here. Let's use the word test underscore, followed by the struct that we are testing. So that's going to be our UI testing bootcamp view. Let's call it UI testing bootcamp view. Underscore the UI component. What component are we going to test in this first test? So if I look at the view, the first thing we're going to test is this sign up button. If I click this sign up button and there's no text in here, I want to make sure we do not go to the second screen. So I'm going to call this the sign up button. This first test is going to be should not sign in. So open close parentheses, open brackets. While we're here, let's make another test as well that is the same thing, but let's do should sign in. So in this test, we're going to actually type in that text field and sign in. Now let's do the should sign in first because I think it'll be easier to record. So I'm going to first Command-Shift-K to clean and rebuild. So let's run our first test. So I'm going to click in here and then click the record, and it's going to launch a simulator. And when it does that, we're going to get this little white arrow here, basically indicating Xcode is ready to record. And our app is going to open just like a user would actually see our app the first time. And then we can test a flow that the user is going to go through. So in this first test, we're going to test typing our name here, clicking the sign up button, and going to the second screen. So first thing I'm going to do is click add your name. And when I click on it, you can see that Xcode is recording what I did. So clearly we have an application that it looks for a text field inside that application called add your name, and then it tapped on that text field. I'm then going to just get the keyboard to pop up here like it would do on an actual device. So I'm going to press Command-K to pop up the keyboard. And in here, I'm going to start typing in my name. So I'm just going to use the letters A for now. We can see that it looks a little funky as it goes, but we can see that the app is typing in keys letter A a couple times. I'm then going to click return to dismiss the keyboard and then click sign up. And when we click sign up, it's going to bring us into our actual app. And when we're on this screen, I just want to make sure that this is the welcome screen. So I'm going to tap on this welcome text just to get that to be recorded. So it shows, just so we can have a reference to this welcome text. That's all we're going to do for our first test. So I'm going to come back into our app test here and press stop on the record down here. And let's take a quick look at some of the code that it gave us. So obviously it looks a little messy at first, but we're just using the recorded code to basically structure how we're going to write our own code. So the first thing that it does is try to get a reference to the app. Now, when we launch the app up here, we can already have a reference to this app. So what I like to do, instead of creating a reference in each test, let's just create one at the class level. So up here, I'm going to say let app, and I'll set it equal to the XCUI application. And then even in our setup with error, we can just reference this app, and we can say app.launch. Coming down into our test, then we don't need these special references to this app and this app2. So I'm just going to delete these app2. I don't even know why I added two different apps, but let's just keep it as regular app. And let's fix all of this. And now let's look a little bit in more detail on what code this gave us here. So firstly, opens the app. Firstly, we're inside our app. It looks for a text field called add your name, and then it tapped on the text field. Then inside the app, there was a key called A, and it tapped on that key. And then it gave us a reference to keys. I guess this is because maybe I tapped it slowly first, and then I tapped it 3 times fast. So in this time, it's giving us a reference to a key, and then tapping that key 3 times. After that, we're looking for a button called return, which was the return button on the keyboard. We tapped that. There was a button called sign up. We tapped that. And then there was a static text on the next screen that was displayed that said welcome. So in this test, really what we're testing is that we have this text field. We can tap on it. It will display a keyboard. And then after we have the keyboard, we can tap on a couple keys. And after we tap a couple keys, we can then click the return button. After we tap the return button, we can click a sign up button. After we tap a sign up button, we can go to the next screen, which is the welcome screen. So this is great that they gave it to us like this, but let's rewrite this now in our own code so it's a little bit cleaner, a little bit easier to read. So let's structure it with a given, when, and then. And the structure is a little less important than in unit testing, but let's try to keep the structure for now. So we'll do given, when, and then. So given, the first thing we're going to be given once we launch our app is that there is a text field called add your name. So I'm going to say given let text field equal, and let's just literally copy this. Text field, app.textfield, add your name. And then we can start writing our when. So when we tap on the text field, so let's call textfield.tap. And now that we rewrote this line of code, so I'm just going to delete it down here. So let's delete that. All right, after we tap on the text field, we then want a reference to the keys, letter A, and then we want to tap on that. So here I'll say let key A, and we'll set that equal to app.keys, letter A. We then want to tap it a couple times. So it types in AAA. So I'm going to call key A.tap. And we can even just copy and paste this 3 times. We tap A 3 times. After that, we click on the return button. So I'll say here, let return button, set it equal to app.buttonsReturn, and we're going to call return button.tap. We can, of course, write this in 1 line. I like to just make it 2 lines. I think it's a little easier to understand as we're learning. All right, so we did the keys, we did the return button. Let's then do the sign up button. So copy this. Let's say let sign up button equals app.buttons.signup. We'll call sign up button.tap. Finally, we want to check that after we do all that, we are on the screen that has a navigation bar called welcome. So here I'm going to say let nav bar equals app.navigationbars welcome. And then we have our then. So what we are checking here is we are checking that the nav bar with the screen of welcome exists. So after we run all this, we want to make sure that this is then on the screen. So we're going to say xct assert true, and we're going to assert that the nav bar dot exists. You can delete this. So now if I click this play button, it's going to launch a simulator, and it's going to run through all of these steps automatically. And it's basically checking that we can do all this and the user is not going to get stuck. So it's going to literally launch the simulator. We can see it here, and I'm not going to click anything. It's going to open the keyboard, type A, So it's going to literally launch the app, click on the text field, type in A 3 times. We actually just ran into one of the funniest things in UI testing. Basically, we tried to look for the capital letter A in the keyboard, and it's only finding the lowercase letters. So it's telling us what it's finding, and clearly it's not finding this A here. So that's probably why it gave us 2 A's in the record version. So we can fix that pretty quickly. So let's tap the capital A, and then let's tap a lowercase a. So I'll do here key A. So just do A. Let's try to run this one more time. It's going to launch the app, click on the text field, type in AAA, click return, click sign up, and then finish the test. And we can see here now that we have a green check because we successfully passed the test. That means it typed in the text, it found this text field, tapped on it, found the letter A, tapped on it, lowercase a, tapped on that twice. Found the return button, tapped on it, found the sign up button, tapped on it, found a navigation bar titled welcome, and that nav bar does exist. So if anywhere along this route the user got stuck, we would know about that when this test fails. Now before we move on, there's some things inside this test that we need to discuss. And the first one is the way we're referencing this text field is based on this string here that says add your name ... And if I look into our view here, and I go to that text field, where is it? We can see that the text field, the placeholder text, is up in our view model and it says add your name. And that's great. But what happens if this placeholder text changes? And maybe instead of saying add your name, it says add name here ... Well, if I go back to my UI test and I try to run the test, let's click play. It's going to launch the simulator. It's going to try to find a text field called add your name. And you can see nothing's happening on the iPhone and we failed this test. And it's because, and it literally will tell us directly, it did not find this element, add your name. It did find, and here's everything that it did find. It found an element that was a text field that said add name here, but clearly that's not add your name. So part of the problem when we're using these keys, these strings, is that if the string changes in the app, our test would then fail, and every time we change it in the app, we would then have to come into our test and change our test. So there is actually a solution. So instead, let's go back to our view here. By default, the text field, this text field, we are referencing it by the placeholder text. That's a convenience thing that Xcode and Apple is giving us. But really what we want to do is add a identifier for this text field specifically. So regardless of whatever the placeholder text is, we always want the same ID for this text field. So on the text field, let's add a .accessibility identifier. And then here we're going to give us an identifier, and let's call this sign up text field. All right, so let's copy that string. And let's go back to our UI tests. And then instead of referencing by the placeholder name, we can reference by this new identifier. So it's called sign up text field. So now if I run it, it's not going to matter what the placeholder is, and we can change the placeholder whenever we want. What it does matter though is that that text field is on the screen. So we can see now our test is working again. It's not based on the actual text that's in the text field. And that's going to be the same concept for a lot of the UI components in our app. So if we look at this function here, the return button is always going to be there because that's part of the keyboard, but the sign up button is another one that comes to mind. And so if I look again at the view here, the sign up button is here, and the UI test is referencing the text inside the label. It says sign up, but you never know if that text is going to change. Maybe it says sign in. Maybe someone changes it to sign in, and we don't want to rewrite our test for that. So again, let's add an accessibility identifier onto this button, and let's call it sign up button. Let's go back to our UI test, and let's just reference the sign up button. Let's check our test still works. We got the green check, test succeeded. So that was the first test that we were testing, and clearly it worked. I hope that did make sense to you guys. But now that we know how to basically write a test, we can move a little quicker and write the rest of our tests. So let's do one for should not sign in. And this test is going to be very similar to this one because it's the same screen. So I'm just going to copy this test and paste it up here. And let's change it up a little bit. So here, given that there is a text field, let's tap on the text field, that's fine, but let's not actually type anything this time. So let's delete this. Let's click the return button, let's click the sign up button, and then here we're gonna have that nav bar, but we wanna make sure, but this time when we click that sign up button, it should not have segued to the welcome screen because this time there was no text being typed in the text field. So this time we're gonna XCT assert false, that the nav bar called welcome does not exist. So let's run this test. We can watch it in the simulator here, and it's going to open up the keyboard and not type anything, and then click the submit button. And we can see that the test now succeeded because this nav bar did not exist. So this here is a great example of an edge case that we are testing in our app. Because, for example, if another developer maybe came into our app, maybe they went to our view model and they decided to comment out or change this guard statement in our sign up button pressed. So now it's not going to check the text field as empty. So if there's a blank string, it will still sign the user in. So in this situation, if I go back and try to run my tests, if I run this test, it's then going to fail because that welcome screen will exist after we click the button. So this is the kind of edge case that we are trying to avoid by writing these great tests. I'm going to go back into the view model and put this back because we do want that guard statement. Let's crush through a couple more tests now. I don't want to make this video too long. So let's start writing another test, and this time we are going to, after we click the sign up button, it should bring us to the sign in home view. So these tests are going to be testing the signed in home view. So let's go back to our UI tests. Let's create a func. Let's call it test underscore signed in home view underscore. And what component inside that view are we going to test here? So let's go back to our view. There are two buttons inside this view. We have the show alert button as well as the destination, the navigation link button. So we're going to write a test for both of these. Let's start with the show alert button. So let's go back into here. Let's say show alert button. And then we're going to say underscore should display alert. Open close parentheses, open brackets. So when I click on the alert button, the alert should then display. And then we're going to create one more function in parallel with that. That is should display and dismiss alert. So in this function, we're going to display the alert and then click the OK button to dismiss the alert. So let's jump in here. I'm going to Command Shift K to get this little indicator here, and the recording button is not red. So in here, I'm just going to press a space bar. So it's bright red now. Let's click record. It'll launch our simulator again. And this time we're going to have to go through the entire thing, but this time let's go into that alert button. So I'm going to come in here. I'm going to type the letters AAA, click the return, click sign up, and then we're going to click on the show welcome alert. Welcome to the app, and then we're going to click the OK button. And that is it for this recording. So I'm going to come back into my UI test, end it, and let's update this code again. And we can actually leverage the code that we already wrote for our previous tests because it's essentially the same thing at the start, right? We have our text field, we type in the text field to click return, click sign up, and then we go to the welcome screen. Then we make sure that the welcome screen exists. So I'm going to actually copy all of that and put that as part of this test. So this assert, we can assert that it's true here, but that's not really what we're going to assert in, but that's not the main assert, that's not the main then inside this test. So what else do we want to do after we get to that nav bar screen? And if I look at the recording, we have our text field, we have our return, click sign up, and then we have some of this new code. There's a button that says show welcome alert that got tapped. So let's add that. So let's say let alert button, and we'll set it equal to the app button's show welcome alert. We'll call alert button.tap. We then have an alert that should be on the screen called welcome to the app. So I'm going to copy this and let's say let alert equals app.alerts, welcome to the app. Let's add an XCT assert true here that the alert.exists. So at this point, this alert should be on the screen. After it exists, we then want to tap the OK button. So we can see here that the alert somewhere inside the child hierarchy has buttons. One of them is titled OK, and then we tap it. So up here, let's add a let alert OK button equals the alert.buttons, and let's look for the OK. And then we're going to call alert OK button.tap. And then our big assert here is that XCT assert false, that the alert.exists. So here, after we tap the OK button, it should dismiss the alert, and we're going to assert, we're going to check that the alert no longer exists after we tap the OK button. So I'm going to delete this, and let's run this test. We'll click play. It should open the simulator and run through this entire test pretty quickly, probably faster than we can actually see it or do it ourselves. But let's watch. AAA, sign up, displayed the alert, and then it looks like the alert did not dismiss in time. We probably checked that it existed too quickly. But what I think is happening is that it takes like half a second to actually for the system to display the alert and then actually click on the button and for it to dismiss the alert. So what we're going to do here very simply is add a second delay before we tap the button and then a second delay after we tap the button. So down here, I'm just going to put a sleep for 1 second. It's literally going to put our app to sleep for 1 second. And then here we're going to again sleep for 1 second. So now let's run it one more time and we should see the same test happen. There will be a 1 second delay when we get onto that alert. So let's click it. Type through the sign up field here. 1 second delay, okay, 1 second delay, and then our test finishes. And it looks like we now have the green check. So our test is now working. We were able to sign in and then click on the display button and then dismiss the alert as well. And the last thing we want to do before we leave this is that some of these buttons, we don't want them to be based on the actual title on the button, but we want to give it a accessibility identifier like we did before. So we have this alert button which says show welcome alert. So I'm going to go back to our UI testing bootcamp view, come to this show alert button, and I'm just going to give it a .accessibility identifier with, let's call it show alert button. And while we're here, let's also do it for the navigation link. So let's give this an accessibility identifier, and let's call this navigation link to destination. Why not? Let's go back to our UI test, and this button, let's call show alert button. I'm going to also call it here show alert button, just to be a little more clear. We then have our alert here, and our alert again is now based on the title that says welcome to the app. Now in the alert, this is a little bit different because if I look at the UI, if I go back to our view here and I look at the alert, I actually can't add an accessibility identifier onto this alert. It's just not a thing. I'm not really sure why that is, but we can't use the accessibility identifier method for an alert. What we do know is that there's always only one alert on the screen at a time. So instead of accessing this alert based on the text, let's just check that there is a alert on the screen, and we're just going to use the first alert that the app can find that is on the screen. So I'll go back to my alert here, and instead of saying alert welcome to the app, let's just say alerts.firstMatch. So the first alert that exists is what will become this alert. We can then leave the alert button as OK because that is like the default text. So I'm going to run this test one more time. Let's make sure with all of our changes it still works. And our test succeeded. Alright guys, so after I recorded this video, I actually upgraded my Xcode to Xcode 13, and then I started rerunning some of these tests, and I noticed that this test that we just wrote is occasionally failing on, I'm not sure if it's because of Xcode 13 or maybe because the simulator is now iOS 15, but occasionally I noticed that this one test does fail. So I dive deeper into it to try to figure out why, and the answer is actually pretty obvious, and it's because of this sleep call. Now, calling sleep is supposed to work. It basically just puts the app to sleep for a second and then continues. But I do know that it is also kind of looked down upon because it's like an easy way out for just delaying 1 second. So I was playing around with trying to figure out another easy way to just add a little bit of delay into this function. So if this sleep method is either not working for you or you don't want to use it, there is another solution that's actually relatively simple. We're going to do it real quick right now. So basically, instead of calling sleep, we can call alert OK button dot wait for existence. So here we reference the button, and we can tell the code to wait until this button actually exists and is on the screen. And in the timeout, we can give this function the maximum amount of time to wait before it fails. So here I'm going to add 5 seconds. So when we get to this line, it'll wait up to 5 seconds until this exists. So if this exists, this will immediately return. But if it doesn't exist immediately, it will wait up to 5 seconds, which should be plenty of time for the alert to exist. Now, you're going to notice that we get this little yellow indicator here that the result of this function is unused. And that's because if we call wait for existence, we can see that this returns a Boolean. And that Boolean is going to be whether or not it exists. So what we could do is something like this, where instead of just calling it, we'll say let exists equals, and then the result of that function. So then after either 5 seconds or it does exist, we will get a value here, true or false. And then we can, of course, XCT assert. And we can assert that exists is true. This assertion is basically asserting the same thing that we were asserting here. Here we already asserted that it existed. So we don't really need both of these. So I'm going to actually just comment this one out quickly. And let's assert it here. And then the same thing for this other sleep. So instead of calling sleep here, we can just call exists. And then here, after we tap on this OK button, we want to check that the alert does not exist. So we'll call alert.wait for existence. So it will wait up to 5 seconds for this alert to exist. And let's call this alert exists. And we should actually probably call this alert OK button exists. Let me just fix this quickly. And then here we're going to wait 5 seconds for the alert to exist. Now after we tap on this OK button, we know it should not exist. So we probably will wait the full timeout. We'll wait up to 5 seconds for the alert to exist. And then after that, we want to assert false that the alert exists. So we want to make sure that it does not exist anymore. And then because we're doing this alert, we don't really need this alert anymore. We can keep it because it'll obviously be true. If this one exists, this one definitely exists. But we kind of don't really need both anymore. So I'm just going to put both of these maybe in the then. And I'm going to run this test one more time now, just without the sleeps, but with the wait for existence, which is probably a slightly better solution to this. Let's watch the simulator here, and it looks like we may have passed. So it's waiting 5 seconds at the end of that, and we got the green check. So this test does exceed now, and we are not sleeping, and it's just another way to do it. If anyone knows a better way to do this than this, definitely leave a comment below. By no means do I think this is the only way to add a delay to UI tests, but it does seem like a relatively simple solution. Alright, and again, I recorded the rest of this video before this section right here. So in 1 second, it's going to transition back to the remaining of the video, and you're going to see that the sleep is going to come back in, and this is going to disappear. But if you're following along, you should probably leave the wait for existence in your code. So while we're here, let's also update this function up here, which essentially is testing the same thing, except this is testing that we should display it, and this one is display and dismiss. So a lot of the code is going to be the exact same. I'm just going to copy the code in this test. Let's paste it inside this one. And it's all going to be the exact same actually, up to, we tap the show alert button, and then we just want to make sure that that exists. So the then will just be that the alert exists. And I'm going to delete the end of this test here. Let's run this test, see if it works. Should. We got the green check, and then there are 2 more tests I want to just quickly run through in this video, and that's when we get to this navigation link. We're going to click on the navigation link, go to the destination, and then we're going to click the back button on the destination and come back to the signed in home view. So let's create 2 more tests, and I'm just going to copy the name of this test here. And this will be test sign in home view. And we're not testing the show alert button, but rather the navigation link to destination button. So I will paste that here. This is the camel case. And we're going to make this one should navigate to destination. I'm going to copy that, and we're going to do one more, and we're going to say should navigate to destination and go back. Let's click inside this test here and click record, and let's run this test quickly. So I'm going to do the same typing. Let's click return, sign up, click navigate. We're on the destination screen, so I'm going to click on the word destination just so we can get a reference to it. And then I'm going to click the back button. And we're back on our welcome screen, which should be, I'm going to tap on the welcome text again so we get a reference to that as well. I'm going to stop recording, and let's update some of this recording code because it looks a little bit ugly. So again, the entrance to this is going to be the same, right? We are going to get the text field, the keys, we're going to click return. We are going to make sure we are on that welcome nav bar. We're going to make sure that we are on that welcome screen. So I'm going to copy this code here. Let's come down here, paste it in. So after we get onto the navbar screen, the difference in this test is that we are tapping on the button called navigation link to destination. So let's get that. Let's say let nav link button, let's set it equal to that, and we'll call nav link button dot tap. All right, so that takes care of us up to this point. We then were on a screen that had the word destination. Now in your actual app, obviously there would be other things that would indicate that you're on that screen, but I'm just going to look for that static text that says destination. So here we're going to say let destination text, and we'll set it equal to the app.staticText destination. All right, so let's make sure that this destination text existed. So we'll say xct assert true destination text dot exists. Then let's tap on this back button, and the back button was titled welcome because it was based on the welcome screen that we had before it. So we will call let back button equal app.navigationbars.buttons, and we're going to look for the one that says welcome. We'll call back button.tap. And then finally, we again want to make sure we are back on this nav bar screen. So I'm just going to copy this assert and make sure it is true when we're down here as well. So let's delete the rest of this. This will be our then. And let's run this test. Let's watch it quickly. And it looks like it succeeded, which it did, which was awesome. While we're here, let's also update this should navigate to destination test. So I'm going to copy this. I'm going to paste it here. And this is going to be the exact same thing, except we're going to stop when we get to this destination and that it does exist. So the then will be that it exists. And we can delete the back part. Alright, so now that we have all of our tests in this file, let's scroll on up and let's click the play button at the class level so that we run all of the tests in this file. And we can actually watch the simulator just run through each of these tests. And I think it does it in reverse order. I'm not really sure why. But we can watch it here, and it's just running test after test after test. And this is so awesome because once you have all your tests written, all you need to do is click that play button and you can just let the computer go and it will run all of your UI tests just to make sure everything is working. And UI tests are obviously important because if a UI test gets stuck, chances are the user is also going to get stuck. So this is literally testing the user flow. And we now, I think, just finished all of the tests. And it looks like we got the green check mark at the class level, so all of the tests worked perfectly. All right, I'm back at the bottom of our file now, and before we wrap up this video, which I know is getting long, there's a couple more tips and tricks that I want to share with you guys, just because you are now testing experts and we can actually write our code a little bit better than what we've done so far in this video. So far we have pretty much, as you probably already realized and dreaded, we have copied and pasted a lot of the code between all of our tests, right? We basically, almost all of our tests have the sign up, they tap the text field, we tap the A button, click return, and that's annoying to have to copy and paste that. Not to mention that if we had a much bigger, more complex app, right, some of those setup functions could get really, really long because, you know, you might have a situation where the test might have to open the app, sign in, and then tap through a whole bunch of screens before you get to the point where you actually want to test. So copying and rewriting all that code is annoying and also really hard to manage. Because if we have to change maybe like this code in one test, we then have to change it in all of our tests. So really, because we are good developers and we don't like to basically repeat our code anywhere in our app, what we can actually do is create modular functions to extract parts of these tests into sub-functions. And I could have done this from the start, but I think when you're just learning UI tests, it's pretty good to kind of go through all of the steps each time just to really understand what's going on. But now that you guys are testing experts, let's go back up to the top of our file and clean up some of this code. So at the top here, I'm going to look at these first two functions that we wrote. So we have sign up button should not sign in and sign up button should sign in. And you'll notice that both of these have the sign up text field. We tap it, we click the return button, and we click the sign up button. And down here, it's the same thing, except this time we tap on some keys. So because we repeated it twice, it would be better to put that in a sub function. So I'm just going to put it down here for 1 second. We're going to move it in a minute. But let's create a func and just call it exactly what it's doing. Let's call it sign up and sign in. Open close parentheses, open brackets. And then we know the difference is for the second function, we tap on these keys. So let's add a parameter here that's maybe should type on keyboard of type bool. And I'm trying to make these as explicit as possible here because I don't care about the brevity of these functions. I want these to be very clear so that anyone else coming into these tests knows exactly what this function is doing and exactly what this parameter is doing. So clearly this is whether or not they should type on the keyboard. So let's take some of this code that we repeated, and I'm just going to copy all of this and let's paste it into this function. We don't need our when in here because we are experts now. We don't really need to follow that. So we have the text field, we tap it, and then if, let's do if should type on keyboard, open brackets, and it should be keyboard. I don't know why I typed keyboarding. Keyboarding sounds pretty fun though. I feel like maybe we should start keyboarding. Anyway, if we should type on the keyboard, let's then do all of these taps. Then we have the return button and the sign up button. So coming back up to our functions here, the first one I'm going to delete the when here, as well as this text field code, and instead we're just going to call sign up and sign in. Should type on keyboard in this first function is false because we should not sign in this function. So very simple. Our test now has 3 lines of code: should sign up and sign in, and then when we look for that nav bar, let's assert if the nav bar exists. Coming down here, same thing. I'm going to delete all of this and delete the text field, and we're going to say sign up and sign in, and of course this time we are going to type on the keyboard and that it exists. And just to prove that it still works, I'm going to run this test really quickly. Let's pop up the simulator and just watch. And it looks like our test succeeded. So much easier to read than before. And because we have all of our tests in this file, I don't want all of these subfunctions to be mingled in between all of these tests. So I'm just going to cut this function that we just created. I'm going to go all the way down to the bottom of this file and just create an extension. And we're going to extend the class that we are in. So I double tap this, we can see that the name of this class is the UI Testing Bootcamp View UI Tests. And what I'm going to do at the bottom is create an extension for that class. UI Testing Bootcamp View UI Tests. And let's just paste in our function. And then I'm just going to put a simple mark here. Let's call this maybe functions, just to separate our tests from all of these excess functions. Coming back up here, now that we have 2 really great tests, let's update this next one where we should display the alert. So firstly, we want to sign in, right? So we're typing on the keys here. So I'm going to call, again, sign up and sign in. Should type keyboard true. So we can get rid of all of this. And now we have this assert that the nav bar exists. And this is basically, the same assert that we have up here. So we already checked that this nav bar will exist when we get to this point. So we really don't need to do it again in this test. Of course, it was great to do that our first route, but now we already tested this, so we don't really need to test it again. And also, if we get to this point and we go to tap on this show alert button, obviously if we are not on this screen, that show alert button is not going to be there. So we would fail this test anyway if this nav bar didn't exist. So because of that, we don't really need it in this test. So I'm just going to delete the whole nav bar section here. And before we finish this up, I'm going to come down here and do the same thing for this function. So we're going to call sign up and sign in true. And then we can get rid of all the way through our nav bar section here. And now if we look at the difference between these 2 functions, and then we can see that we have when we click the show alert button, Then we try to get the alert and assume that it exists. So let's create a subfunction for this. I'm going to create it right between here. Let's call func tap alert button, open close parentheses, open brackets. Let's just put this code in here. And in our when, let's just call tap alert button. And then we can, this is kind of all part of our then. So given that we sign in and sign up, we tap the alert button, and then we can assert that the alert exists. Coming down here, again, here we have that code where we can tap alert button. Now again, just like in the last two tests, we already checked that the alert exists in this test. So when we're down here, we really don't need to check that it exists again. So I'm just going to delete this. All right, and then of course, after we tap the alert button, in this function, we also want to wait and then dismiss the alert. So as a parameter to that, let's say should dismiss alert, and that will be of type bool. So in our first one, we are going to tap should dismiss is false, because we're just going to tap on it. In this one, we're going to tap, and then should dismiss is true. Now, of course, we need a little bit of code in here. So if should dismiss alert, open the brackets, and let's see. So if we should dismiss the alert, we need to get this OK button, which in order to get that OK button, we need this alert here. So we need this code, this code. We need to tap the OK button to actually dismiss it, and then we can wait to see that it does not exist anymore. So I'm going to cut this bit of code here and paste it in our should dismiss alert. We can get rid of this assert here. So if it should dismiss alert, it's going to also dismiss. It's going to also dismiss the alert. So then coming back to our code, after we dismiss the alert, we then need to, again, we're waiting for existence, but we don't have a reference to that alert. So I'm going to, let's just copy it here quickly, and I'll delete this sleep. And again, we don't need double asserts here. So I'm just going to do this first assert, and we can even make this just one line of code because it will look a little bit cleaner. So alert exists, let's just put it here. And now you can see just how readable these tests are, right? So this one, sign up and sign in, tap alert button, should dismiss true. Let's check that the alert does not exist. Piece of cake. You guys are testing experts. Let's cut this function also and move it down to the bottom so we have our separate section for our functions. Coming back up here, we got two tests. Let's just run that test quickly just to make sure that it still works after all of our changes. Let's sit back and watch the simulator do its magic. All right, and it looks like we have succeeded this test, of course. Coming on back down, we have two more functions to update. We have our should navigate to destination. So again, we have the text field section, so we can of course reuse that code. Sign up and sign in, should type keyboard true. And you guys can now start to imagine that if we did this from the get-go, like this would have made our tests so much faster, because if we want to rewrite this test next time, we just pop this in, we just pop in our tap alert, and then we're done. It's quick, it's fast, it's easy. But anyway, again, we don't need any of this code anymore. We don't even need this welcome section, and we just get to this section where we tap on the navigation link, and then we want to assert that the destination text exists. So I'm going to move this actually into our then. And then let's make a subfunction for this. We'll say func, let's say func tap navigation link, open close parentheses, open brackets, and then of course we know this next function is going to be the tap the navigation link and then dismiss it. So let's say as a parameter should dismiss destination of type bool as always. And let's put in our code here. Let's tap on the navigation link, and then we'll say if should dismiss destination. And then we have a little bit of code down here, the back button, and we tap it. So I'm gonna copy that and put that into our should dismiss destination. All right, so when we tap navigation link, should dismiss false, and then we can assert that we are on the destination. And then in our next function, like look how much code we have right here. And now all we're gonna do is literally delete, and then we're gonna delete all of it pretty much. We're gonna do sign up and sign in, true. And we don't need any of this, except we do want this nav bar line because that's where we're going to assert at the end that it still exists. So I'm just going to move this down to our then, and then let's get rid of this, and we'll say tap navigation link, and this time we should dismiss destination. And then we can assert that we are back on the nav bar screen. Again, I'm going to move this function down to the bottom of our file just to keep it nice and organized and clean. And now that we've rewritten these, you can see how they are so much nicer and easier to read. This is much more practical for our app. Let's click this play button and one more time just confirm that all these tests are still working. And I'm not going to make you guys sit through this, so I'm just going to skip forward. All your tests should be succeeding. If they're not succeeding, you probably typed something wrong. And there's one final thing that I want to go over with you guys before we actually finish this video. And it goes back to just the very first thing that I was talking about in UI tests, is that UI tests are testing the flow that real users are going to actually use and click through in your app. So it's not a theoretical situation if someone is going to tap this. This is an actual situation of a user is opening your app and going through this flow. And if you've used pretty much any app that requires you to sign in, after you sign in once, chances are they don't make you sign in every time you open the app, right? So right here, I'm clicking to sign in and we sign up. But if this was my real app, we would have this user logged in. And when they close the app and open it back up, they're going to come right into our login page. They're not going to go back through the sign up flow. So when we're creating UI tests, we, as I said, want to mimic exactly what the user's behavior is going to be. So the question then becomes, if we have to launch the app every time, how can we launch the app so that the app knows this user is already signed in? And it's a little bit tricky, and this is part of the reason that we need to use dependency injection for unit tests as well as UI tests. So I'm going to jump back to the UI testing bootcamp view. So again, if you forgot, because this video is getting pretty long now, we have this boolean in our view model that is current user signed in, and it's a bool, and we set it equal to false to start. So once this gets toggled to true, we are then moving to that sign in screen, right? So if current user signed in, sign up, signed in home view. If not, we have that sign up layer. And that's great. But the question is, how do we start our app with current user already signed in? If you're up to this point in my channel, chances are you know what user defaults are. And we use user defaults all the time in apps to save and persist data like this. So you could keep a boolean of current user signed in and then just pull it out of user defaults. And that would fix the problem when you're opening and closing the app on a simulator. But that's not going to fix the problem in our UI tests, because when we run UI tests, so it's not like we can launch the app, add to user defaults, close the app, and then launch it again and hope that those user defaults stay. Instead, what we can do is pass arguments into the app as we launch it. So what I'm going to do is go to the very first file when I run my application. So as soon as I run my app, it's going to go to my app.swift file, which in my project it's called Swiftful Thinking Advanced Learning app file. And this is where your @main is. So if you don't know what file in, just search for @main and you're going to get to this. And I will delete some of this. This is going to be basically, as soon as you launch your app, this is the first file that executes. It opens up a generic window group and then the first screen in your app. So this in production would probably be like your your home screen or your router screen or base screen or whatever you want to call it. But basically, when we launch this app, we want to pass in some specific arguments so that we can then set manually that that current user is signed in. So what I'm going to do is first click the product and go down to Scheme and then Edit Scheme. And another way to do it is we can click on this little icon here and click Edit Scheme. And it's going to edit the scheme for the current build that we are working in. And in the Run tab, and on this screen, we can then pass in, it literally says arguments passed on launch. We also have environment variables that are going to be passed on launch. So here we can add some small things that we want to pass in to the app as we launch it. And usually these are things like should start signed in, maybe should ignore welcome message, very simple commands that might change the flow or the setup to your app. So what I'm going to do here starting, we're going to just do an argument passed on launch. And I'm going to press the plus and I'm going to call this dash. And let's call this maybe, we're only going to use this argument for UI test. So we're going to call this UI test. Let's do it maybe an underscore and then start signed in. You can click enter. And we can see that it is checked by default. So now if we run our app, it's going to pass an argument that literally just says dash UI test underscore start signed in. And I use the dash. I'm not sure if we actually need to use a dash at the beginning, but I know it's like common practice and a lot of people do it. So I'm just going to play it safe and go with the dash at the beginning. And then I'm calling this UI test just because we're going to only use it for UI tests, but you definitely don't need to use the words UI test for all your other arguments. So when we run this, this is what's going to pass. And I'm just going to copy this quickly just so we have the exact string. And I'm going to close this. And now let's create up here. We're going to create an init. So the init is the first. So the init here is going to be the first initializer that is going to execute when we run our app, right? Because this is our app file. This is not a view. This is the app itself. And we're initializing the app. So inside this init, we then want to check all of the launch arguments. There's two ways to access the launch arguments. The first one is the command line. We call command line dot arguments. And these are literally, this is an array of all of the arguments that we're passing in on launch. And as you know, we have one argument right now, so it's just going to be an array with one string. And we're going to check if this array dot contains, and then we're going to paste the string that we're looking for specifically right now. So here we're going to say if command line arguments contains UI test, open the brackets. And let's create just a very simple Boolean here. We'll say var user is signed in of type bool. And we'll set it equal to false to start. And then we're going to here we'll add user is signed in equal to true. So if we run the app and this argument is there, user signed in, this variable will be turned to true. And there's a quicker way to write this, but I don't want to confuse you guys. So what we're going to actually do is just copy this bit of code. And we're going to say var user is signed in of type bool equals, and we'll use a ternary operator. We'll say command line arguments, if it contains that, question mark, true, otherwise false. Because we are learning to be awesome Swift developers, we can make this a let. And now it's just one line of code. And let's just print out, let's print user is signed in, colon, and print user is signed in real quick. All right, so we have that argument, and I'm gonna press play on the simulator so we can get some stuff printing out to the console. So if everything was set up correctly and we have this working, obviously, user signed in should be set to true. And user signed in is set to true. Now, of course, our app doesn't reflect that yet. But what you guys can see is that the launch argument is being passed in. And just to show you guys, if we go back to edit the scheme, we can always turn it off. And then if we run it, user signed in is going to be back to false. So these arguments we can always toggle. Some other common arguments might be if you wanted to like change the country or the time zone, you could do that and maybe toggle it for like certain testing or debugging, things like that. But anyway, now we have this variable user is signed in. And of course, we want to connect this into the rest of our app. This is where dependency injection again is required because we need to inject this value into our view. So I'm going to go back into our view here. And we have this current user signed in that starts as false. And instead of starting it as false, let's initialize the view model with a starting value. So we'll create an init in the view model, and let's just pass this in. We'll call it current user signed in. We'll set self.currentUserSignedIn equal to the value we're passing into the function. So here we're going to set up this, and here we're passing in this. And now every time we create the view model, of course, we need to pass in a value for current user signed in. And we don't have that value in the view. So what we're going to have to do is create a custom init for our view. So this view model will be of type UI testing bootcamp view model. And we'll create our init here. And in the init, we'll set underscore VM. Again, we're using underscore because we're referencing the state object. So we'll set it equal to a state object with a wrapped value, and we'll pass in our UI testing bootcamp view model. And again, we're going to pass in a value for current user signed in of type bool. Now we'll paste that here. So now every time we create this view, such as in this preview, we need to pass in a value for true or false. And I can then go back to my app file. So the first view in my app is going to be the UI testing bootcamp view, which of course is looking for a current user signed in Boolean. So when we create our init here, let's then set up some of our starting dependencies. So we'll say let current user signed in of type bool. And in here, I'm just going to very simply set self.currentUserSignedIn equal to user is signed in. So we're going to set up this variable, and then we'll just pass it right on into our view. We don't need this print because we know it's working. So just like that, we can now inject this current user signed in. And if this was like your production app, you might want to add some logic here. Maybe that if it was going to production, maybe not to check this and instead pull from user defaults. But if you're in like a debug scheme, then obviously pull from this command line. We'll get into that in a future course. But right now, let's just check it out. So let's go back into our scheme and turn it back on. And let's build and run to the simulator. And now, when we load this app, hopefully it starts signed in. Awesome. And this is awesome because now we can start a UI test from this state. We don't need to go through the whole onboarding every single time. Before we actually do that though, I just want to point out that there is another way to access these. I'm not sure why there's two ways, but there is definitely another way that you might see. I'm going to comment this out and let's just make it the same name here. So we'll say equals, and we can call processinfo.processinfo. And then we can call .arguments just like above, and we can do the same contains true and false. So again, this is the exact same thing. I'm not sure why there's two versions or two ways to access the launch arguments, but if I run this should do the exact same thing, which is awesome. And finally, I want to point out to you guys that it is definitely more common to just do launch arguments like this. Keep it simple is definitely my recommendation. But if we go into the edit scheme and we look, let's turn this off quickly. We can also add in environment variables, and they work pretty much the same way, except they have names and they also have values. So here we just had an argument. It was just a string. We couldn't add any kind of value to it. Here, I'm going to add one, and let's call it pretty much the exact same thing. We'll say dash UI test underscore start signed in, and I'm just going to add the number 2 just because I don't want to confuse you guys between the two. In reality, we only need one of these in our app, but let's just do start signed in 2, and we can then give this a value. And here in the value, we can put in, I think it's only strings. So this is going to come through as a dictionary. So we have a key and then the value. And I'm just going to put the word true. I don't think it's going to actually be a Boolean. I think it's going to be a string, but the string will say the word true. So now we have this environment variable. Let's close this and let's actually access that environment variable. So instead of this line of code, we're going to access again the process info dot process info, this time dot environment, and we can see the environment now, instead of an array, it is a dictionary. So we're going to access the environment dictionary, and then we're going to pull this value from the dictionary. So I'm going to pull it like this, and I think it's number 2 that we added, and of course this is going to return us a string. So let's say let value equals that, and then let's set the value for current user signed in, and we'll set it equal to, we'll check if value is equal to the word true. Let's put true, otherwise false. So we need to convert that string to a Boolean. So same thing now, we can run it again. This time we have an environment dictionary. You can do some custom stuff if you want to, if maybe it's not a true or false thing, it's got a whole bunch of different values you might add, but you can see it still works. So let's wrap up this video quickly by actually using this in our UI tests. Because when we run our UI tests now, it's running this code, but it's not actually running this scheme, right? So this scheme that we just set up is specific for running our main app. We have to edit the scheme in our UI tests separately. And because I think the launch arguments is a little more popular, let's just start with that. So I'm just going to, let's turn back on the UI test start signed in, and I'm going to turn off the environment variable because we don't need it if we're using this first one. So come back here, let's put this back in. I'm going to leave the code commented here just so you guys have a reference. Let's jump to our UI tests. All right, and again, let's scroll back up to where we actually launched our app. And as you guys can see here that we need to pass in those command arguments before we launch our app, because those are arguments passed on launch. They're not passed in after app loads. They're passed in on launch. So really before we launch the app, we need to add in all of our arguments. And I guess this was poor planning on my part, but the problem we're going to have in this video right now is that if we pass in the arguments on the launch, all of our original tests where we have to sign up and sign in are going to start failing because the user would then be signed in and we don't need to go through that sign in and sign up. So let's do one example, but I'm not going to spend the time to rewrite all of our tests. In reality, in your actual app, almost every single file you would probably be starting signed in, except for when you were testing your onboarding. So oftentimes you can just still set it up like this, but add in your arguments on the setup with error. It just so happens in this one file, we have tests where the user is signed in and also tests where the user is not signed in yet. But just for example's sake, before we actually launch the app, let's call app dot, and here, very simple, we can add the launch arguments, all the arguments that we want to add to this. And as we know from before, the launch arguments is an array of strings. So we'll set it equal to an array, and we got to add in all of the arguments that we want here. So the argument, of course, that we are looking for is the UI test start signed in argument. So let's just paste that right in here. And it's that simple. So now we're going to pass in this argument and then launch our app. So our app will launch with this, and we know if this is passed in, we should then start on that signed in screen. So I'm going to come down here. I'm just going to come down here where we have our final test here, where we have the navigate to destination and go back. I'm going to copy it and just do another version of this. And let's just call this number 2. And of course, this time we're going to be starting our app signed in already. So we actually just don't even need the given here. And I'm going to Command-Shift-K to get this little indicator going. So we have the same test that we have up here, except we don't need to go through that whole sign in, sign up flow anymore because we're going to start signed in. So let's click play on this simulator quickly. And let's check this one more time. Let's see if it works. We are launching the app and it should start signed in already. Awesome. From there, we tap on the link and go back. And this test is now working with our user starting in the signed in state, which I think is great. Obviously, all the other tests are going to fail now because we have the sign up and sign in part included in all those tests. So for right now, I'm just going to comment this out because I don't want all of these tests to fail. Going back up before we wrap up, I also just want to point out that we can also add app.launch environment. The launch environment is a dictionary with keys of string and values of string. And then here we could do the same thing. We could add in values into our dictionary, which is, I think it would be like this. And then we would put in the word true, and then the launch environment version would work. I'm not going to go through the rest of that because you guys get the point. But that is it. That is all I had to tell you guys about UI tests. The video was actually much longer than I had expected, but I hope this definitely helped you guys get going. I know our UI in this video wasn't very complex, but I hope this was enough for you to actually start adding some UI tests into your app. And if all else fails and you really don't want to go through all this effort, at minimum, you could just record some UI tests and just leave them in your app, just to have some recordings of some of the flows to make sure like something is working. But anyway, the more tests that you have in your app, generally the better, because we can just sleep easy at night knowing that the code that we wrote is functioning as expected. Alright guys, thank you for listening to my voice for such a long time. If you enjoyed it, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button, leave a like, leave a comment, and if you're feeling up for it, join us in our brand new Discord channel. I will leave the link in the comments below. It's also on my channel page. We have a new Discord server, which is basically a community of Swift developers, myself included. And in there, we can just share code, ask each other coding questions, and it's been a lot of fun so far. So I hope to see you there. All right, guys, thanks for watching. As always, I'm Nick. This is Swiftful Thinking, and I'll see you in the next video.